Hey, Mr. Larry.
Hi, Mr. Barnes.
Hi, Tabitha.
Hi.
Hi. Crystal, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. I can hear you.
Good. Okay. Well, we're going to go ahead and start. Looks like you two are it. And again, if you have any questions at the end, I'll go ahead and unmute you and we can talk about it.
All right.
All righty.
Let's go ahead and start our week 2 live meeting for the legal research class. And after reviewing the 2 chapters, there is a lot of probably repeat information in these 2 chapters, and some of it I noticed is kind of dated. The book was published probably about the time that the internet was just starting, and so the authors, especially in chapter 4, have a lot about the internet and how to do searches, and a lot of it we're all very familiar with now. So there may be some overlap with some of the information that you already are aware of. Where we start, and you've already discussed this in our discussion question, and if you've looked at the assignment for this week, the assignment is to go online to these websites and just navigate around. You can't do too much without the password that you need to get into these. As far as I know, the college has not. You have to, of course, even as a college, you have to pay for these search engines, Westlaw and Lexis, and the college has not done that. So you probably are only going to get some preliminary information off of the website. And you notice the 2 most prominent is Westlaw and LexisNexis. These are the 2 that most attorneys use in the United States, and they have extensive information, Lexis especially has information beyond just doing searches of the case law. They have some other information that is helpful in trying to locate somebody, and they you can do those kind of searches on Lexis. As we talked in the discussion question this week, the negative part of Westlaw and Lexis, and let me mention I prefer Westlaw just for the simple reason that I'm familiar with this KeyCite system that Westlaw devised many years ago. And so I got familiar using the KeyCite system when I was doing legal research in the actual books. And so I that's the preference I have, is that because I'm familiar with the KeyCite, it's probably easier for me to do research on Westlaw. Lexis is, of course, a fine search engine and even has some advantages that Westlaw doesn't. Well, there are a couple of more search engines that you can made available to you. When I mentioned that the Westlaw and Lexis is expensive, the problem is they charge by the hour. And so you can imagine if you're doing searches, and you're paying by the hour, there of course is a premium on how much time you spend in doing the searches. So there are some alternatives that are available to attorneys who may not want to spend the kind of money involved in using Westlaw or Lexis. And one of these is called Lois Law. And the advantage of Lois Law is that they have a pricing system that probably is better for small firms. And they offer the even like a monthly fee. And so for firms that don't want to spend the money, Lois Law is a good alternative because of the price, that it's not as expensive. They may not have all the bells and whistles that Westlaw and Lexis have, but they still, for the price, it's an adequate kind of search engine. One reason that you may not want to use Westlaw or Lexis is because the information is all over the United States. See, for many attorneys, really the only law you're dealing with is in the state where you practice. So any kind of database that gives you the state law, the case law, the statutory law in your state, that's going to be enough. The Westlaw and Lexis, if you're a large multi-state firm, then you may be using Westlaw and Lexis to find the law in different states. But for the most part, an average attorney is probably only going to want to research in their own state database. That leads me to CaseMaker. CaseMaker is free to attorneys through the Bar Association. And I'm not sure if every bar association does that. I know Florida, where I practice, CaseMaker is available free of charge if you're a Florida bar member. So that's an advantage that CaseMaker has, just that it's free, that you can do your research and not be charged for it. Now, I may have mentioned before that one advantage you can do, and there are other free websites that you can use, that if you use the free ones, then you're going to be able to do an initial search. But once you narrow down the topic, the search that you have, you then can go to the paid websites, and you're not going to have to spend as much to have to do that research. Now, we've looked at this in the last chapter, but it's certainly worth looking at again as to what is expected. How do you even begin to do these searches? And you're faced with a situation. The client has come to the law firm with a legal matter, and the first thing you're going to do is, what general law are we talking about? If the client's been in an automobile accident, obviously there's many legal statutes and case law involving auto accidents. It's the personal injury is the area of the law. If you're in a firm that has a criminal practice, you're going to have individuals who have committed a crime who've come for you to defend them. And that, of course, would be under the criminal law area. So you want to at least identify what area of the law you're dealing with. If you had a probate matter, something regarding the interpretation of a will, then you're going to be dealing in the probate law area. And that's where you're going to want to begin your search. The second step, what type of law are you looking for, is generally it's either going to be case law or statutory law. Many of the legal areas that we deal with today, there are statutes that cover the case that you're dealing with. Probate is an example. There is a probate statute in every state. So, of course, you're going to be looking at the probate code in your state if you're trying to identify if you're going to be dealing with a probate case. Now, believe it or not, contracts law is still generally governed by case law. The law of contracts is still pretty much case law. So you're going to be looking at the various cases that involve contract law. Now, it has been modified. There is a statute in every state called the Uniform Commercial Code, and it is known by its letters, the UCC. And the Uniform Commercial Code does affect, and it's a statute in each state, it does affect the sale of goods. And so there are certain kind of contracts that are under statutory law. So these are some of the questions that you want to ask as you're preparing to do your research. What secondary sources do I investigate? I mentioned previously, you may want to start with the legal encyclopedias that have our whole legal system identified by subjects in a encyclopedia. And so you would go to the encyclopedia in probate, and there would be the issues involving in a probate case. So that's a good place to start. Now, also, every state will have what we call practice books. And these are written by attorneys who are experienced in a particular area. And you will have a practice book. Let's say if it's a landlord-tenant issue. I know in Florida, in fact, a judge wrote it. There is a practice book that goes step by step as to what happens if you have a landlord-tenant case. And so in these areas that you're going to be dealing with, there are secondary materials that can help you with your source. What source will I select to find the information? Well, generally, that's going to be determined by the law firm you work with, if you're fortunate enough to be with a large firm that can afford Lexis or Westlaw, you of course are going to want to search through those databases. If the firm isn't as big, you may be using Lois Law, and even smaller firms could be using the Casemaker. And there are some other sources that you could use to determine that. Well, we've talked before about, and really the beginning of your research, you have to formulate a query. And I've mentioned before, the query is always in the form of a question. And this is the issue that is to be decided in the case that you're dealing with. And the authors give you an example of how you formulate that query. And let me find that in the textbook. On page 44 of the textbook, the authors have given you a case that you can use as an example. And as with any case, this is the facts. In other words, this is what the client would, in your first initial meeting, provide you with. Eric Winke rents a small one-bedroom apartment for 12 months. When he moves in, he pays a $1,000 refundable deposit. He has no written agreement with the landlord. Eric later decides to buy a condo and finds a perfect one not far away. When the closing date is determined, Eric writes a letter to give his landlord 30 days' notice. Furious at Eric's short notice, the landlord refuses to return his deposit, despite the immaculate condition of the apartment. Eric has come to the law firm. He wants to sue the landlord to get his deposit back. And you want to answer the question, can he get his deposit back? So in using the 5 steps that we previously talked about, obviously, if we're dealing with what's the general legal topic, it's going to be landlord-tenant law. And it also involves real estate, but generally the case law is going to be under landlord-tenant. Now, what type of law are we looking for? I can't always generalize in every state, but I would guess that in most states, the landlord-tenant law is by statute, so that you would go to the statute books in your state, and there would be a landlord-tenant statute. And so you're going to be using that as the basis for your search. Now, there could be cases interpreting the statute, and so you certainly would want to use those. What secondary sources do I investigate? And again, here's where these practice books that I mentioned come in handy. In fact, I mentioned in Florida, there is a practice book for landlord-tenant law. And so that might be a good source to find the information that you need. We talked about what source do you use. And again, that's going to be determined by the law firm that you work for. Now, lastly, how do I formulate my query? And here's where the authors give you some examples of what we're talking about. And what you want to look for when you're determining what the query is going to be is, what are some of the terms that would be involved in the case that you're dealing with? Well, obviously, one is tenant, landlord-tenant. Those would be terms that you'd be looking for. The issue at question is deposit. That for most landlord-tenant, for most rental agreements, the landlord requires that the tenant put down a deposit to for damages to the unit. And finally, what are the issues involving notice? So that those are the areas that you want to use to formulate your query. And so an example would be has the tenant given the landlord adequate notice so that the landlord is required by the statute to return the tenant's deposit. So that would be an example of a query that you would want to use to do your research. Now let's move on. I mentioned chapter 4 is probably a repeat, and this information is pretty much common knowledge now. And the authors kind of give you a heads up here, and they start off with welcome to the internet. Well, we're pretty familiar with that by now. And they talk about the search engines that are available. They mention Google. The Microsoft has a search engine. There is a Firefox search engine. Google has a search engine called Chrome. And so we pretty much are familiar with these various kinds of search engines. And beyond Google, there are some other search engines that you may not be as familiar with. Ask.com, I've never used that, but I'm not sure personally how it's used. And Clusty is another one of the search engines that you could use in addition to the standard Chrome, Microsoft, and Firefox. The search directory, there are certain websites where you can find information regarding areas of the law. And what I want to mention is it's called Find Law. And it's in the book on page, let me make sure I got the right page, 60 at the bottom of the page. And Find Law is a very good website that discusses current issues in the areas of the law. You can search under certain areas. And so it is a good resource for if you're interested in using something besides the general search engines that everyone is familiar with. The specialty search tools, again, you're going to, after you've done internet, the legal research on the internet, you're going to find areas that you are more comfortable with. And so it's a trial and error situation. You're going to find websites that you get more information from. And so it really is a personal decision as to the kinds of websites that you want to use. That if you happen to come to the situation, and this does happen, and the authors mention this, that if you have a situation where you just cannot find anything, it could be that what you're looking for just doesn't exist. That would be rare, but there is a possibility of that the area that you're looking at there's just not a lot of information. So again, that's not going to happen very often, but but that's always a possibility. But usually what the problem is that your query is faulty. And generally, if you cannot find information that you need, you probably need to go back and redo the query. You may have made an error in something that you searched. And so this is why you can't find it, is you're not using the correct terms. So again, someone's described it as like a treasure hunt. You're going to be searching this myriad of information, and again, to try to find the information that you need may take repeated effort, and you may have to use 2 or 3 searches to finally get to the information that you need. So I'm going to conclude the meeting at this point, and Tabitha, did you have any questions?
Yes, sir. I don't know why is Lexus like what more is less expensive than Westlaw and why is Lois Law is expensive? Not expensive. Why is Westlaw and Lexus more expensive than Lois Law?
Have you heard of a monopoly?
No, sir.
What I mean is Westlaw and Lexus pretty much control everything. They pretty much have a monopoly over this information. And so unfortunately, it really comes down to that they're going to charge whatever they want. That's
crazy.
That's why they're so expensive, is that they have acquired all of this information, and it is expensive. It's taken years to acquire this information. And so they are kind of how could we say it? They're kind of the bullies in the industry.
Yeah, it's crazy.
They have the money, and the resources. And
True.
So they pretty much control how the searches are done. And so they really can charge whatever they want, what it comes down to. There are these other types of search engines. That's why Lois Law is used by many smaller firms, because it's not as expensive. The way it's priced is better. And as I mentioned, the case maker is free to attorneys. So they're certainly going to take advantage of that. But that's the problem, is these two companies, if you've noticed this before, in any area where, like the big banks, they can charge anything they want. The oil companies control the gasoline, and so it's a situation where they have so much control that they're able to charge more, is what it comes down to.
That's crazy.
Yeah, that unfortunately is the situation. And but they do have to spend a lot of money in developing this material. So that is one of the problems. Do you have anything else you want? And I wanted to mention both Tabitha and Crystal. One area that you can use to do searches, because we're going to do a couple of searches in the next couple of weeks, is Google Scholar is a very good resource. And if you want to try that out, you go to the Google Scholar website, and it will have, you can put in certain terms and it will bring up case law, just like law and Nexus.
Because I never heard of it. The Google.
The Google search engine. Yeah, go ahead and go on the internet and type in Google, and then add Google Scholar, and it's a good resource for doing legal research, and it's free. They don't charge anything.
I have a question. When I was on Westlaw, just navigating around for our writing assignment,
Mhm.
is it that when you search a certain topic, it brings up books and then it tells you to pay for those? So is it going to narrow down the item that you're looking for once you pay for it, or do you have to look through that item once you've purchased it?
You probably are going to have to look through the item once you purchase.
Okay.
Yeah. The way you narrow it down is after you've found the information, then you have to narrow it yourself.
And I think just with being able to go to all three of them so far, I would go to Casemaker to narrow it down and then go back to Westlaw to pay for the correct book.
No, in fact, I've suggested that go to a free site first, and then get some information. Get the general information. Then if you have to narrow it down, but again, it's going to depend on the firm that you're working with. And generally, because it's expensive, the Westlaw and LexisNexis are pretty much large firms because of the cost. That really is the reason. Well, any other questions?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Okay. Well, in fact, I was going to ask you, Tabitha, was that your question, whether we had some kind of registration with Westlaw? When you
No, is that like when I go into Westlaw,
Mhm.
trying to find my research and stuff, like they say they ask for the registration key.
Yeah, don't worry about, for just this assignment. You want to just get general information about the website.
All right. So what should I do? Like, where should I go to?
Just when you get on the website, just look at some of the areas that are available there. That's all.
All right.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna end the meeting at this point.
All right.
Y'all have a good weekend.
You too. Leah, you can come back, baby.